Welcome, thanks for coming. This is a panel on the subject of war, which is also the subject of a class. 3 of my students are involved in, a number of others who are here as observers. The leading off will be Brighton Richardson, who's talking about Frederick the Great's development as a commander. Yes? Okay, just, sorry, I'm trained to respond to raising hands. That's robotically. I think you can study that in the psychology department, explain it. Next is Caitlin Hollis, who is writing on American counterinsurgency in Vietnam, and Eric Hunt will be concluding the presentations. His subject, he'll have to correct me if I've got this wrong, but it's basically the development of American infantry tactics in the Spanish-American War, which is, I think, a topic for which he's very well qualified. All right, I will turn it over then to Brighton, who's going to be leading off.
You're all good.
Mr. Patterson asked in particular that when we get to the question stage, and there's going to be a lot more time for question and answer than there was with the previous session, that so that he can record this, if you have questions, please come to the mic, because although people in the room can hear you, the recording devices can't hear you unless you come to the mic. So in the question portion of the program, please come to the mic. Okay. Sorry about the delay.
You're all good. Hey everybody, I'm Brighton Richardson. I'm currently a sophomore here at Oglethorpe, and like Dr. Orm said, I'm presenting on Frederick the Great as a commander. I'm going to be specifically focusing on 2 battles, the Battle of Mulwitz at the beginning of his career, and Leuthen about 16 years into his career. But before that, I'm going to give a little bit of background about Frederick the Great. He was born on the 24th of January, 1712, to Frederick William I, who was the current king of Prussia. And Frederick William I is kind of a weird guy. He never actually fought in a war during his kingship, and he held the kingship until he died. But he thought that the training of the Prussian military was extremely important. Not only that, he played a large role in the economy, in the school system, in really bringing Prussia to an economic power in Europe. He never really understood Frederick the Great. He thought he was not the brightest child, and so consequently he was very violent with him, and their relationship between Frederick William and Frederick the Great really wasn't very good. So as Frederick the Great gets older, he joins the Prussian military with a good friend of his, Hans Hermann von Katt, and eventually they both decide that they want to escape Prussia, to get away from Frederick William's rule, and Frederick William doesn't really like this. So they're captured on their escape, I guess, and they're both charged with treason. Now, Frederick the Great doesn't take this too seriously. He is almost angsty with his father. Treason is a punishment of death in Prussia at this time, but he's like, look, I'm the son of the king. I'm the next in line to the throne. What's going to happen? So Frederick William makes a point by executing his friend von Katt in front of Frederick the Great and banishes him for 2 years to Kustrin, where he studies military tactics and military history and really gets a large amount of knowledge on how exactly these battles, these different battles in history go. He comes back after 2 years to Prussia, and then in 1740 succeeds his father in becoming king of Prussia. And so the first battle I'm going to be talking about is now shortly after this. It's called the Battle of Mulwitz. So very soon after Frederick the Great becomes king, Charles VII of Austria dies, and his daughter Maria Theresa becomes the Queen of Austria. And Frederick does not like this at all, because Prussia at the time is several different territories on the map that are not connected, and he wants to connect them. So he decides in 1741 to invade Silesia. And this is a very large portion of territory that encompasses several different Prussian territories. Maria Theresa doesn't like this. She thinks it's aggressive. So she sends a man named, what is his name? His name is Wilhelm von Nipperg, I believe. Is that right? Okay. Close enough. Nipperg, along with a 20,000-man army, to Silesia to basically push Frederick and his Prussian forces out. They travel north to Silesia, and as they're traveling north, they actually pass Frederick's army and cut Frederick and his Prussian forces off from supplies and communications. Really big mistake right off the bat. You never want to be in that position. And they end up occupying the town of Ness. So Frederick decides that it's going to be a good idea to go attack the Austrians, and he travels north to Ness as well. At the time, there's some inclement weather. There's fog, there's snow, a lot of wind, and it hampers both sides' movements towards the town. But he gets there on the 10th of April, 1741 at 9 in the morning. And he gets there, and the Austrian army is facing northeast, which is the exact opposite direction that Frederick is coming from. Most of them are either asleep or eating breakfast, and no one knows that the Prussian army is like on their doorstep. Frederick has total element of surprise, and rather than using it and taking the Austrian army, he decides that he's going to form his battle line, and it takes roughly 4 hours. In this time, the Austrians have seen Frederick. They have now made their own battle line and are now totally ready to fight the Austrians. So Frederick kind of lost any sort of advantage that he had. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the forces start moving towards each other, and right off the bat, the Austrians send a large cavalry force down the right side to attack the Prussians. The Prussian cavalry tries to intercept them. They're pretty much decimated. It's not fun for the Prussians, and the Austrian force keeps moving towards the right side of Frederick's battle line. Frederick's general that's at his side is named Marshal Schwerin. Schwerin tells Frederick that it's time to go. Prussia's probably going to lose this battle. There's no need to get captured. So Frederick leaves. No escort, no place to meet. He just rides in the opposite direction of the battle. Schwerin turns around and decides that he's just going to make the battle work. So he positions certain forces to the right of his battle line where the cavalry is coming from, and they start volleying, volley after volley after volley. And because the Prussian military was so well trained by Frederick William, they fired at a much faster rate than the Austrians or any other European power at the time. So they destroy most of every one of the Austrian cavalrymen, which is a large blow to Austria. And then once the Prussian forces actually meet the Austrian forces, their volleying again just outmatches the Austrians. And so the Austrians break their lines. Many of them surrender. I believe it's roughly 6,000 are killed, which is a large chunk of the 20,000 that Nippurg was sent with. So Prussia wins, and basically the mistakes that were made by Frederick were that he let himself get cut off. He didn't take advantage of attacking the Austrian force when, they're asleep or eating breakfast. And then he retreats, which in my opinion is the worst, because as a morale thing, that's terrible. If my commander's leaving, we've pretty much already lost, in my opinion. But those are the three main things that he did wrong, and he later calls Mollwitz his school, he says Mollwitz was my schooling, because, he made so many mistakes. So fast forward 16 years, Frederick has fought several wars: the First Silesian War, the Second Silesian War, the War of Austrian Succession, and now we're beginning the 7 Years' War. Maria Theresa is still in power. Frederick is still in power. And prior to the Battle of Leuthen, in December of 1756, I believe it is, 1757, I apologize. Prior to that, Frederick is touring through Germany. A month before this battle, he gets Prussia's biggest victory, the Battle of Rossbach, which is a huge military success for Frederick. It's like his prime example of why he's such a good commander. While he's touring in Germany, Austria decides that they're going to take back a good portion of Silesia, and they occupy the main city of Silesia, which is it Breslau? Okay, so I'm close enough. And so Frederick doesn't like this, so he marches towards Breslau. And before he gets there, he gets to the city of Leuthen, and he meets an Austrian army of roughly 80,000 men, which is more than double of what he has. I believe his army is somewhere between 35 and 37,000. So it's this gigantic army, and it's led by a man that I don't remember off the top of my head what his name is. It's Charles something. He's an Austrian guy, a good friend of Maria Theresa, the queen. So over the last 16 years, Frederick had really gotten good at flanking his enemies, almost like using blitzkrieg that Hitler used in World War II. And the Austrians had realized this, and so they decided that to fight him at Leuthen, they were going to make a line that was 4 miles long. So his troops spanned 4 miles. And the point of this was he can't flank us if the line's that long. So Frederick sees this, and he maneuvers his troops before the battle in a way that really allows him to cripple the Austrian army. He splits his forces into a cavalry unit and infantry, and the cavalry moves straight towards the Austrian line. And then his infantry unit moves to this patch of low hills, and it's pretty hard to see them. And so Charles, the Austrian commander, can't see them and thinks they're retreating. So he moves a large portion of his forces on the left side away from the 4 mile long line. And then Frederick moves his forces around the hills and behind the Austrians. So the cavalry is moving straight forward along with support from, I believe they're 12-pound Prussian artillery guns. And most of the Austrians are occupied by this, and Frederick's infantry swoops behind them and just starts volleying, and complete havoc ensues. The Austrians break lines. Many of them die. Many of them simply flee. A lot of them end up surrendering. And at the end of the battle only takes, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 or 5 hours. 20,000 Austrians are either killed, captured, or flee, and the Prussian casualties are around 6,300. So it's a large difference. So Leuthen is much more of a military success for Frederick for several reasons. One, he doesn't retreat, so he doesn't give his troops the thought in the back of their mind that, oh, we've already lost. Not only that, he used pre-battle maneuvers to basically outsmart his enemy. Even more so than that, he just decimates a very good portion of the heart of the Austrian army. 20,000 casualties is a quarter of their force, which is a very, very large hit to them. And so Frederick, as a commander, went from an inexperienced 28-year-old guy that just became king and doesn't have any idea what he's doing to becoming a master commander, both tactically and being able to use his force in a formidable and cohesive way that allows him to run through his enemies. And so Leuthen is considered one of his greatest victories ever. It's one of the greatest victories in the history of Prussia. And that is my presentation, if anybody's got any questions. Mike.
During the first battle that you discussed, is there any reason to believe that Frederick's general, by any chance, chose to trick him into retreating in order to take control of the battle himself?
I've read that. One of the books I had to read, actually, is by Christopher Duffy, I believe. Is that his name? Christopher Duffy discusses it, and he kind of makes the claim that it wasn't like a well-known thing, but many people kind of believe that part of the reason why he told Frederick to leave was because Frederick was so inexperienced versus Schwerin had years of experience. He was a general under Frederick William I, and I think that there's probably good reason to believe that there was some ulterior motive there. What's that, ma'am?
So you've made very clear the difference between Frederick at the first battle and the second battle. Now what I'm wondering is, How did he have a mentor through these 16 years, or just through his own experience try and fail?
That's a good question. It's more trial and error. Frederick fights Mollwitz as the very first battle of the War of Austrian Succession. He ends up fighting the War of Austrian Succession, the First and Second Silesian War, the War of one other that I don't remember, and then the 7 Years' War is at the beginning. So he spent the last 16 years really starting to understand how the tactics worked, as well as how to maneuver his army and how to be a much more effective commander in the face of battle.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Alrighty then. Thank you, guys.
Hello, I am Caitlin Hollis, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm going to be doing counterinsurgency in Vietnam. And before I begin, I want to make it this farther away from me, and then I want to make it clear what I'm actually talking about. Counterinsurgency in Vietnam is the type of warfare that we executed while in Vietnam. I'm not discussing the politics or the negativity that was embraced in the homeland here in the home front. That is not the purpose of this. It is the type of warfare that we executed, just so everyone's not confused. Okay, Vietnam is clouded with lots of negativity. A lot of people deem it immediately as defeat, and it was not a successful attempt by the Americans. To be able to address this, which is what I will be addressing, was it a defeat or was it a victory? We need to understand exactly what insurgency and counterinsurgency is. So bear with me, I will be reading some definitions. Insurgency is the organized use of subversive and violent to seize, nullify, or challenge political control of a region. This, in Vietnam's case, was North Vietnam, the communists. Counterinsurgency is a comprehensive civilian and military effect designed to simultaneously defeat and contain insurgency and address its root causes. It requires the joint forces of the host nation, those leading the COIN, counterinsurgency, movements, which is led by a joint force commander. We, in this case, are the counterinsurgents movement. We were working with South Vietnam, who were trying to establish a democracy in their nation. Now that we know the players, let's now address the field. Counterinsurgency requires a different mindset than that of any other type of military action. It requires understanding of population, high acceptance of insurgent actions, comfortability around the population, and a unified approach. Counterinsurgency does not work as one nation alone. The United States was not working by itself in Vietnam. It was working with South Vietnam, which is important to remember. In counterinsurgency, you will have your joint force commander. In this case, we went through two. We had originally one who was not very successful, and then after 2 years of much defeat and loss and negativity, we then moved on to the person we will be addressing, who was, in my opinion, quite successful. You also have, in counterinsurgency, your operational approaches. Your operational approaches are based on your JFC, understanding of the operational environment and the specifics of the insurgency. Successful development of the operational approach requires continuous analysis, learning, assessment, dialogue, and collaboration between commander and staff, as well as other subject matters, expertise, including multinational partners and unified action. And then you have your environment, the OE. The approach for counterinsurgency must come from realistic, achievable objectives which properly align ends, ways, and means. This is done through understanding the environment and is accomplished through the joint intelligent preparation, understanding the relevant actors and physical domains of the envelopment. So now let's go to Vietnam. We will start at the end of 1965 with General William C. Westmoreland, who was the current joint force commander in Vietnam for the United States. The Joint Force Commander will never be the home nation, as in Vietnam. Most of the time, your Joint Force Commander will be the ones that are coming into the environment and is working with the nation to improve the means that they are reaching. Westmoreland requested a high amount of troops. He constantly was asking for more and more people to join Vietnam. His goal was to inflict as many casualties as possible because he believed that the success of war is deemed by how many deaths your enemies suffer. He used search and destroy tactics, which was high cost, and the enemies were easily to avoid it. One, because they understood the environment more, and two, because he wasn't exactly attacking the right places. The U.S. quickly saw the lack of success in this tactic, and they decided to change to a clear and hold tactic, which would provide greater protection for the Vietnamese people and reach a level of greater political stability. The importance of this to remember is that counterinsurgency is to help develop the people of the country. You were not there to win a war, you were there to help the people. In this case, we were trying to establish a democracy within South Vietnam. To actually achieve this goal and to quit just killing people all the time, which is more Westmoreland's idea, we brought in General Criggin Abrams and a new ambassador, Ellsworth Bunker. And this, we'll just be calling them Abrams and Bunker for the continue of this. Abrams he felt that the war needed to be brought back to the attention of the Vietnam people. He spent his entire first year as the deputy to Westmoreland. He was not actually granted the commander yet. He spent his entire first year touring Vietnam, understanding the people, the villages, and trying to see the effect that our first 2 years there had done. He quickly learned that there was no change. The Vietnam people did not feel like they were being represented, and the goal of democracy was not being closer reached. So he then developed a weekly intelligent estimate update, which we will call WIU. A WIU was, in many ways, a metaphor to represent his entire approach to Vietnam. It was a weekly meeting every single Saturday where all of his commanders would sit and they would discuss the exact order every single time what was going on. They started with weather. Weather is very important in counterinsurgency. You have to remember that in counterinsurgency, you're having to deal with a different country, and not so much like dealing with another country as in World War II, where you're in Europe and you're out on a field and you're fighting. You're having to deal with the natural weather, the people, and the established communities that they already have. Winds, cloud cover, visibility, rainfall, monsoons, traffic, soil conditions, temperature, all of these were huge battles in themselves in Vietnam. Many of the times we were fighting weather. It was men having to trudge through monsoons day after day. There was a month alone in Vietnam that experienced more rainfall than 10 years of Vietnam collectively experienced. They would determine what the weather was going to be through the current weather, anticipated weather, and they would have long historical tracks of what the weather experienced at this time of the year. In many ways, in the beginning, when Abrams stepped in and was like, we're going to spend an hour every Saturday talking about weather, people kind of put it aside. They didn't feel that it was important. However, after time, his commanders saw the high importance of this, and it was, in many ways, the most serious talk of their meeting. The Corn movement was dependent more than any in the past on weather, as stated before. It's weird. Rain could be more important than a gun. The second part of the meeting was geared around intelligence. Abrams believed that 90% of wars were won on intelligence. This was more than anyone else believed before. If you knew what they were doing, you could win. That was his idea. All of his intelligence was based on long-term goals. Yes, it was a weekly meeting, but it wasn't necessarily geared to what we're going to do on Monday, what we're going to do on Tuesday. It's what are we going to do on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday that's going to affect Thursday or next Thursday or a year from now. He wanted to keep everyone focused on the idea of establishing democracy in Vietnam. The meetings concluded with statistics. This was a simple count of supplies and casualties. However, he didn't believe that the measurement of casualties was the measurement of success. No matter how many people were dead, no matter how many people survived, that had, in many ways, had nothing to do with if democracy was being established. You could kill 1,000 North Vietnamese, but unless 10 South Vietnamese felt that they were getting their voice out and starting to become a democracy, it didn't matter. He was a highly detailed man, Abrams was. He wanted to win the war in exact precision ways. Just like he had his organized meetings, he wanted an organized war. So we move into 1967. Abrams was the year 1966, was everything we just discussed, was organization, not too much was done. Moving on into 1966, instead of thrashing around deep jungles seeking to bring the enemy to battle, and at times places of their own choosing, Allied forces now set up positions to protect villages. They were no longer seeking out the enemy, they were having the enemy come to them. They were either protecting the villages or they moved into tiny, small subunits that would go around and try to defeat larger enemies, which was different than Westland before, who was sending out very large, huge tactical groups and facing them in straight battle, which they would lose. They wanted to keep zones and prevent offensive attacks because they knew that the North Vietnamese knew the land better than we would. If they were to come in with large military tactics, we were most likely to lose. We might not suffer as many casualties, but we would have a harder time holding the villages. Moving on to 1968. This was the year that the war became a lot more. This is when the negativity grew. This is when the large offensive attacks from North Vietnamese to the American side, as in people at home, started to become very successful. You have Tet and you have Mini Tet, and then you have the third offensive. Large offensive attacks after offensive attacks were placed on South Vietnam. Just like in our way, to the people at home, they were seemed very bloody and unsuccessful, but really, in many ways, it was hurting North Vietnam more than it was helping them. The North Vietnam would come down with large offensive attacks that Abrams was able to quickly see ahead of time because of his gathered intelligence. He knew exactly how they were going to attack. He knew where they were going to attack. And part of knowing was that he knew where we would win and where we would lose. There's especially a message he sent to Washington a couple of days before one of the largest Tet battles occurred, and he said, we're going to lose a lot of people. It's just going to happen. Because he believed that part of intelligence was knowing when you're going to win, knowing when you're going to lose. His intelligence was gathered through his small patrols that were out attacking small North Vietnam subunits. As they were moving out through the jungles, they were catching these large groups of North Vietnam coming. These large offensive attacks, they knew they were coming. They were anticipated. We weren't easily able to defend them, but we were able to defend them. But the big problem that was occurring here in terms of counterinsurgency was these battles were put close to villages. And even if we were winning, and even if more Vietnam people were more North Vietnamese were dying than South Vietnamese and Americans, the South Vietnamese people were in danger. The war was never fought in North Vietnam. It was always in the South. And that was the problem, because that's who we were trying to protect. And with people dying all the time, it's hard to say that you're doing your job. So with all these large offensives going down, and America starts to become more involved. Now you have the negativity of the war. And Nixon and presidents begin to want to pull out soldiers, even though that doesn't work. The key part to remember about counterinsurgency is patience. It doesn't work in a day. You don't protect a village. You don't establish democracy in a day. Everything takes time. The American people weren't ready for this time. They were seeing American soldiers die. They were seeing people die. All they saw was the violence. They didn't know they didn't understand our purpose. And our purpose was, as Abrams discussed, to establish a democracy. In the very beginning, he said, the very beginning, his goal is to win. And to win, to Abrams, is to achieve fundamental Allied objective, an independent South Vietnam, free to determine their own future. It wasn't a war in the sense that let's defeat the North Vietnam. It was establish and help South Vietnam. Unfortunately, the American people didn't understand this. So due to the lack of understanding, troops began to get pulled out, people were being pulled out, and Vietnam was being declared over. They wanted to end the war. However, the counterinsurgency was not done. It takes time. As anyone knows, living in our decade, things that happen in the Middle East, they don't take time. They don't happen in a day. That is also a high topic with counterinsurgency. It's not a battle that is won, as in, you move here, I move there, I kill the most people, I win. So it sounds like we were successful. We were holding off offensive attacks from North Vietnam. The Abrams, he was successful, but he was losing at the same time, if that makes sense. Vietnam's hard to understand. So when it moves into determining victory, you have to flash forward to when the withdrawals occur. Abrams says this withdrawal isn't an option. We're going down. We're going to continue to go down until there's none of us left. He was losing people. They were being pulled back to America, so he no longer had the support he needed. He knew it was lost, but at the same time, he was deeply passionate about his goal to achieve free people in South Vietnam. The day before he left, Bunker, who was his ambassador, told him this, and I think this is, in this way, it's a high testament to the work that America did in Vietnam and to Abrams' dedication to what he was trying to achieve. He says, I suppose when the history of this war is written, it'll be very clear that no country ever put as many restraints on itself as we did. I think it's been probably the most difficult war that we've ever tried to fight. It's been faithful to our country because I think the question is whether we have the patience and the determination and the will to accept the responsibilities of power. Certainly, the armed forces of the United States have shown determination and will and steadiness in the most difficult situation. I think it's certainly clear to me, that without your leadership and without your colleagues have done here, there wouldn't be any Republic of Vietnam today. And this has been due to your leadership, not to only high intelligence and professional skill, but to sensitivity, effectiveness, and with that, the Yankees may play common sense. And that means you gain the confidence and the trust of the Vietnamese, which has been essential to success here. So although it is deemed as a victory, as a defeat, I think there are a few things we did in Vietnam that would have led to far greater success if it didn't get strung up in the politicalness of all of it. As we started to try to work out our ceasefire with North Vietnam, in many ways you could say, took advantage of the negativity that Americans were experiencing, and were able to use that to get the United States out of Vietnam. In 1970, a poll was taken around South Vietnam, and 90% of the population felt that they were still opposed to the communist rule. No matter what they deemed the U.S. attempt successful or not, they still were opposed to the communist rule that was attempting to take over their country. Looking back at the timeline from 1965 to 1968, when troops were high and there was aggressive tactics and violence, there was high level of frustration, and the South Vietnam people were not happy. Moving on into when Abrams shows up, they have decreased the size of forces. South Vietnam's military has increased military capability. They're more effective civil administration and establishment of constitutional process, land reform, and increase in agriculture. In other words, I think the comparison of Westmoreland to Abrams is in itself a testament to war versus counterinsurgency. Large, aggressive tactics don't work. Coming in and being focused on the people and what the people want is what's going to work. And unfortunately, I don't think the people who pulled the people out of Vietnam truly understood that. In many ways, it can be counted as a loss, but it's clear that based on the actions of men who fought there, that they were noble people that did what they needed to do, and they understand that the importance of establishing what a country needs. And I think the U.S. did a fine job trying to help them out while they were there. Thank you. Does anyone want to ask me any questions? Not at once. Everyone stop. Okay.
So Eric is next.
I was in here for the honors presentations earlier, so please, if you've been sitting here for as long as I had, stand up and stretch a minute, and I'll organize my notes for a second. No. This is at will, please. Oh, at least one person took me up on the offer. That was for you, not me. So I'm Eric Hunt. I'm a staff sergeant in the Georgia National Guard, and I'm an infantryman. So I'm going to talk about the development of infantry tactics in the Spanish-American War. When I say the Spanish-American War, this is a naval war. It's amazing naval victories. The American Pacific Fleet sunk the Spanish Pacific Fleet, and the only casualty we took was one person died of heat exhaustion in the boiler room. So why am I talking about infantry in the Spanish-American War? Well, there's some developments that occurred around the Spanish-American War. Specifically, the time frame is 1898. So the weaponry used in the Spanish-American War by the infantry soldiers is essentially the same weaponry used in World War I. The American forces were armed with the Krag-Jorgensen rifle. It's a Springfield design. It's a magazine-fed bolt-action rifle. The Spanish had the Spanish Mauser rifle. The difference between the two is a slight difference, but the Spanish Mauser has a detachable box magazine, so it could be loaded faster in the heat of battle. But it's essentially the same weapons that went into World War I. They also used two different machine guns. The Spanish had the Maxim machine gun, which is a water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun that was used extensively by the British in World War I. And the Americans had there was a Colt Remington model, I believe, that's, again, it's an air-cooled, belt-operated, or belt-fed, gas-operated machine gun. stopping the definition there, it describes the same machine gun that I've used in the Army today. So the development of tactics here is how do you deal with modern weaponry and machine guns as an infantryman on the attack? We hear a lot that World War I favors the defense because machine guns are defensive weapons, and there's nothing you can do to, the attacker is severely disadvantaged facing a machine gun. So this is the question I want to ask. So the first question is strategy. Napoleon defines strategy as the use of, you have to use time and space in military operations. And Napoleon says time is the more important because space you can win back, but if you waste time, you can never get it in return. So I want to discuss time as relates to Napoleon versus the Spanish-American War and then into World War I. So a Napoleonic soldier could fire 3 to 4 rounds a minute from his musket. In the Spanish-American War, this ratio is, the rounds per minute per soldier is something on the order of 16 to 20. So time, if your leader has to make a decision, you have to send a runner to the general. And Napoleon was notorious for being very top-down. There weren't a lot of devolution of decision-making. Small unit leaders didn't have a lot of authority. But in Napoleonic times, if it takes 10 minutes to send a runner to Napoleon and say, do we need to attack now? And in 10 minutes he can run, get the answer, and come back. There's a certain amount of fire that occurs in that 10 minutes. So adjusting that in the Spanish-American War, because of the amount of fire, that 10 minutes, an hour might as well have gone by on the front. So the speed of decision-making is elongated simply because of the speed of the action on the ground. All right. So in the Spanish-American War, the American general, General Shafter, he reminds me a lot of, if you've read War and Peace, the way Tolstoy deals with Kutuzov. He's a large man, for one, and he doesn't seem to be very involved on the front line and allows battles to sort of take place as they would. Tolstoy seems to think that leadership has no meaning in battle. But I get a different sense from this because Shafter doesn't have, in the Battle of San Juan Hill, Shafter doesn't have any direct control over a lot of the maneuvers that take place. That doesn't mean there's no leadership. It means the leadership is devolved to a lower level. So there's particularly in the Battle of San Juan Hill, the line gets bogged down at a barbed wire fence, and the Spanish are raining withering fire on the American forces. So a lieutenant runs up to his captain and says, we can't keep this position. And the captain says, we don't have time to ask anybody. And the lieutenant says, well, I'm going to attack. The captain says, well, I can't authorize that, but I'm not going to stop you. So the lieutenant just runs out and makes the attack happen. So he's not specifically authorized by his command to do this, but he's given the authority to take his men and charge up the hill. And so devolution of leadership to the lowest level becomes very important. And this is seen in the Spanish counterpart as well, as there was a redoubt slightly north of San Juan Hill that American forces were assaulting. In the course of the assault, they managed to shoot the commander of the forces, and as soon as they see that their commander has been shot, they surrender. They're still in heavily entrenched positions. They still have a very good chance of surviving the assault by the Americans, and they give it up there. I apologize somewhat. Dr. Horn reminded me 2 days ago of a book that by Stephen Biddle. I went out to the library and got it, and I started to reorganize my entire report because he said a lot of the same things I wanted to say. So what Stephen Biddle describes as the modern system, and he says this is how you deal with machine guns and large volumes of infantry fire. And he says the elements of this are cover and concealment, which are the ability to either not be seen by enemy forces or to not be hit by enemy fire. small unit level command, dispersion of forces just spreading out. And I'll talk about each of these in a minute. And there's a combined arms actions between infantry and artillery. So to speak about cover and concealment, and the main resources I used when researching this, I had the manual of infantry drill from 1891, and the same manual produced in 1904. So the only thing that's happened in between is the Spanish-American War, and these are the lessons they've learned from that war. And the most important difference is, and you can see it right away, the very first thing that the 1904 manual talks about is the extended order, which is troops spread out in skirmish formation on the assault, and how to spread out to avoid both artillery fire and rifle fire. In the 1891 manual, this isn't even taken up until page 400. So we get a focus on the extended order as opposed to the close order, which the close order is used for bayonet charges. An additional thing we see is there's a focus on, both manuals explain use of the ground, but it's continually pushed in the 1904 manual that you must take cover, you must use every accident of the ground to approach the enemy and to force your assault. In the 1904 manual, it states that anytime units are halted, they would either take a knee or lay down on the ground to avoid enemy fire. So this is, in the 1891 manual, they have to be specifically ordered to either take the knee or lie down on the ground. And it seems like a simple thing, but if you just tell, if the soldiers are trained to always wait for command, then they're not going to have not only the initiative of individual leaders, but they won't have individual initiative on their own as soldiers. There's an additional problem of when the Spanish-American War started, there were only 28,000 people in the United States Army. There were approximately another 100,000 in the National Guards, but each was held by the governor and by the states. And they didn't cooperate with each other. They didn't have standardized doctrine. They didn't even have standardized uniforms. They didn't have standardized weapons. So the National Guard units that came up, a lot of them were essentially gentlemen's clubs. And so after the Spanish-American War in 1903, the Militia Act of 1903, or the Dick Act, standardized these things. It provided federal funding so that the National Guardsmen were actually paid federally instead of by the states. And in trade-off of this, the federal government got some control over what the doctrine of the National Guard was. They were required to stay with the doctrine of the Army federally. They're also required to use the same uniform as the federal Army and the same weapons and equipment. And part of the impetus for this was when the 71st New York Volunteers showed up for deployment to Cuba, fully a third of them had never actually fired a weapon. So these are National Guardsmen serving in the United States military. Presumably they're going to be our line of defense if the country's attacked. A third of them have never actually fired a rifle. And so they had approximately 2 weeks to actually train in military drill before going to Cuba. And this is why the Militia Act of 1903 was so important. Like I said, I'm sorry, I got this extra book and it kind of threw me out of whack here. So now, how important is this doctrine? Obviously, if the lieutenant can run out and cause an attack immediately, and this isn't anywhere in paper, what accounts for it? It's a sort of a point of pride passed around the Army. There's a pair of quotes, and I want to read one that's supposedly by a Soviet commander, observing U.S. operations. He says, one of the serious problems in planning the fight against American doctrine is that the Americans do not read their manuals, nor do they feel any need to follow their doctrine. And the second is along the same lines. Supposedly, this was a Nazi commander, and he said, the reason the American army is so effective is that war is chaos, and the American army practices chaos on a daily basis. So but it's important, the doctrine, even if it doesn't show what happens in individual cases, and it doesn't show exactly what training is occurring, it shows what the lessons have been learned. So there are some problems in the implementation of the modern system and in the lessons that we did learn from the Spanish-American War. Like I said, Stephen Biddle said there's a very important element of suppression and combined arms between infantry and artillery, and that's not really achieved after the Spanish-American War. The manual for infantry drill doesn't say anything at all about artillery, except in how to attack an artillery piece, but it doesn't include the use of artillery in the infantry advance. So this is, now these are combined on the battlefield, especially with in the Spanish-American War using naval guns. The American landing goes virtually unopposed, but there's a naval barrage that accompanies it. So these ideas are understood, but they're not incorporated fully into the system. They would be later. Your current military manuals do have much more integration of mortar fires and artillery fires and these sorts of things, but at this point they're still being felt out. Like I said, they're understood by commanders, but they haven't made it into doctrine yet. So now the conclusion of the Spanish-American War is somewhat of an anticlimactic. It's the Americans end up surrounding the city of Santiago de Cuba, and the naval force is defeated. Preparing for an attack, General Shafter calls for the Navy to come in and bombard the town so they can come in and take over. So they would be suppressing the town with naval guns and coming up into the town. And before they're able to even do it, the Spanish garrison surrenders. So there's a certain point where lessons we may have learned more lessons had the war finished to not a satisfactory conclusion, because obviously we don't want more people to die, but if there had been more experience involved, we may have learned more lessons, is the takeaway here. But as I said, there were important gains in the manuals. As I said, there's a much greater emphasis on cover and concealment. Suppression as well takes a more important position, as the manual of 1904 explains that units shouldn't move up simply as a whole group online. The 1891 manual has units move up in bounds of 50 meters or so. So they'll go up 50 yards, stop, fire a few rounds, then they'll all stand up, go forward 50 yards, stop, fire a few rounds, and so on. And it's explained that you want the whole unit to move at the same time. In the 1904 version of the manual specifically states that squads would be moving, as one squad moved, the other would fire. And then once they were set and they could start fire, the second squad would move in. So that's how things are done today. Now, the volume of fire is slightly higher today, but this idea of bounding units in is exactly how things are done today. The second development in the 1904 manual on a unit level is that attacks aren't described as simply frontal attacks. That is, the drills that individual units would go through would not be simply frontal attacks, whereas in the 1891 manual, all attacks are straightforward up to 30 yards and then a charge with bayonets. In the 1904 manual, they have these bounding attacks that get up. When they start to get close, the unit on one side would make a turning movement and go across while the second unit stayed and fixed the enemy in position. So, and that describes in different numbers of men, but it describes exactly how Battle Drill 1 and Battle Drill 1 Alpha and all of the other battle drills that take place on open ground are still written in military manuals today. So, as I said, there's a lot still to go forward before the full implementation of the modern system. Machine guns are still considered artillery after the Spanish-American War, and wouldn't be decoupled from artillery for several years yet. But there are certain individual leaders, specifically President Roosevelt talks about a Captain Parker, who was an artillery captain, and not only did he move his artillery behind a hill and fire from defilade using signals from the front, but he moved the machine guns up as far as he could and had them on the front lines of the infantry prior to the advance. So when the trench lines were built around Santiago de Cuba, the machine guns were in the front with the infantry and were able to fire. The machine guns were firing counter battery against enemy artillery when it was seen. And so artillery on both sides was either suppressed or had to be moved behind hills where they couldn't directly see the battlefield. So, as I said, these things had to continue to develop, and in World War I, the development of greater technology that could fire artillery further distances, and things like gas and so forth made things even worse for people. But the beginnings of the modern system can be seen coming out of the Spanish-American War.
We need to define terms like suppression.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It's another difficulty for me. I give a lot of classes to infantrymen as a sergeant. This is my job, and so there are certain things that I don't think about. So to define suppression and dispersion as suppression is firing ordnance, whether artillery, machine gun fire, rifle fire. You fire at the enemy, and the enemy he can't move. He's fixed in place. So ideally, he has to hide in a hole and can't fire back. But at the very least, you want to keep him from being able to move. So if the enemy can't move and you can maneuver, then you can defeat the enemy by maneuvering into a better position, a separate unit. So this is how a flank attack works. You have your initial unit is in place, firing at the enemy, if the enemy's here, continuing to fire on the enemy so that they're suppressed and they can't move anywhere. And then you bring a second unit up from the side and sweep across to wipe them out. So that's suppression. Dispersion is, it doesn't mean that you're moving units apart from each other, but you're moving individuals apart from each other. So the important thing here is that the range of a bayonet is not much longer than my arm, but the range of a rifle is some possibly 500 meters. So it's not important that that we be shoulder to shoulder to be able to protect each other. So dispersion would mean that in the manuals of 1891, dispersion is 2 paces apart. So no two soldiers would be any close than, say, from here to over here. Modern manuals, because of greater rates of fire and these sorts of things, would spread people out even further. So 3-21-8, which is the current infantry platoon and squad, would say in a typical environment, I wouldn't be any closer than 10 meters from any other soldier. This would protect me. It would keep, if I'm hit with machine gun fire, then no one else is going to be hit, or a hand grenade. It limits liability to a single person as opposed to wiping out an entire team or squad.
This is just really a summary, Eric, but so the later manual differs from the first manual. Could you give us a summary of why you think those changes can be found in the later manual?
Well, the experience on the battlefield is the easy answer, but it's not a very helpful one. Okay, what was learned was essentially you've got, if you keep your people together, and this is the default state in the early manual, is you keep your people at close rank, essentially within arm's length of everybody else. So as you press your attack, the enemy fires volley fire at you, or they fire with a machine gun and they hit 2 or 3 people at once, and it's very easy to do. The second is if everyone has to wait for the command, they're not immediately seeking cover and concealment on their own, then they open themselves that much more up to fire. So by following specifically the dictates of the earlier manual, people expose themselves to fire more. So lethality isn't nearly as, to give some other definitions, the Army looks at competencies in terms of lethality, mobility, and survivability. So survivability is staying alive, lethality is killing the enemy, and mobility is being able to move. The changes in the manual are almost, you don't see many changes that increase lethality. I mean, you see a little bit of encouragement to make sure that you can always, that whatever position you take, you can perform effective fires on the enemy, but presumably that's, the leader's going to direct that in the earlier manual as well. But mostly what you see are efforts to increase survivability, so to keep the individual infantryman from being shot in the process of the assault. So in the earlier manual, when moving towards the enemy, there's not a, the exact wording, let me see if I can find this in my notes. This was somewhat technical, but the exact wording is important. The earlier manual, for instance, has soldiers never load until the moment to fire has come, and where the second manual, the later manual, pieces will be loaded as soon as at the point of deployment, which is approximately 1,200 meters from the enemy. There was something else I was looking for. Okay, well, I can't find the exact wording, but the effect is that both manuals encourage the individual infantryman to seek cover as he's moving towards the objective. The earlier manual says that they say this almost the same thing, but in a different way. So the earlier manual says that as much care as should be taken to not differ from the line of assault, with some consideration to finding cover. The later manual says you should move forward to the place of best cover, and then when you get back up, to resume the original line of assault. So both are suggesting the same thing, but they're putting the emphasis on a different way of going about it. So the lesson is that cover is more important, because even if you get there in a straight line, well, if you run in a straight line, you're going to be shot. And if you stay in cover, even if you go off the line of assault initially, you can get back as long as you're alive. If you're not breathing, obviously the assault has failed. So.
Okay. I may be overcoaching here, but I'm thinking in terms of take-home points. So the way that an attacker deals with a modern battlefield characterized by high volume of lethal fire from rifles and machine guns is dispersion, cover, and suppression, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, knowing that, how well were American soldiers prepared for World War I based on this experience? There's some difficulty, because the Americans also had an ability to view how the soldiers of World War I were fighting prior to our entry. We were latecomers, as
we know. But the American effect, and I have enough national chauvinism, I guess, to not say that Germany was just so tired of fighting that America was the excuse for them to quit. But we have, official acts of Congress have made General Pershing the second highest ranking general that will ever be in the military, next to George Washington. And this was after the fact. So there's at least that evidence that the American contribution was very great, and not just in terms of showing up and tipping the morale of the Germans over. But we also, I mean, if you look at Sergeant York, when his activity was done essentially on his own without even contact with superior officers. And so the ability of soldiers and non-commissioned officers like that to act independently, I think that shows the preparation that American soldiers had for World War I, and what made us better prepared to be there, even if we didn't have quite the experience in the trenches that the Europeans had when we got there. We had this tradition of low-level leadership.
It was a good answer to a possibly unfair question, because it went beyond the bounds of your presentation. Other questions for Eric Hunt or anybody else on the panel? Thank you all for coming. Thank you, presenters. We'll be hearing from you.